somebody else's experience is priceless. And that's what all of this is about is, so, I'm kind of, I always believe, hey, if you can go get that paper, do it. And I always tell Nick, without that PhD, I lack credibility everywhere I go because I don't have.
Sharif has his PhD. He's totally credible.
But I'll tell you what, Nick will tell you, just like any, I get the job done.
It's the world of academia. It's a different world. So
academia is its own class, just like chess has its own cult.
Right, chess has
and
its own
so
cult.
I truly, respect anyone who can go get paper, but getting that experience and making it successful, not giving up, and being humble with it. Because you're very humble. Because I truly I admire the way you keep saying, that you didn't know.
I like in the spirit of disclaimers, we should tell kids not to do what Shakeel did. Don't try this at home, because he is a professional.
Yeah. He does the disclaimers, then he talks. That's a good idea. For those
renegade, right? Look at all of it. Nick, you'll agree with me. All of the very successful, very, very successful people we interviewed that we had exclusive interviews with, none of them finished their college degree. Every one of them had that same sense. I got enough information and education.
Stay in school.
But they didn't get their degree, and they still were successful. So
stay in school. The job market's wrecked. That's the reason you go. For those who've just joined us, we have Kimberly Calhoun, who's a director at IBM TV, also sits on the board of advisors at North Carolina State's Computer Science Department. Jim Eade, who's a FIDE chess master, also author of Chess for Dummies, who is published worldwide. So he sits in San Francisco. We have Sharif, who's our PhD scholar that gives us total credibility out of Malaysia. Alexander Starr, who actually runs our investment show on Wednesday, also does Chess Stars on Saturday, 2 of our shows at IBM TV. Shakeel Latimer, who's a professional investor, who always does his disclaimers before he talks, out of Sydney, Australia. And with us, our Pulitzer Prize winner, and also a New York Times bestseller, David K. Johnston, who wrote the book, The Making of Donald Trump. He also wrote the book that deals with taxes, Perfectly Legal. And that's the book I went to the bookstore looking for, and I couldn't find it, David. I went yesterday specifically looking for your book. I already have that one.
You can get an ebook at any moment. You can get the ebook at any moment. Downloads in 2 seconds.
Oh, really? Okay.
I will say this.
Download time.
I got
his book is something like It's Worse Than You Thought. Tell us a little bit about that book.
It's worse than you think.
The way of avoiding US taxes is to remain like myself and Sharif and just stay out of America. And then you don't have to pay American taxes. It's the perfect situation.
All right, you and I need to talk backstage.
Yeah. David, tell us a little bit about your latest book, because I love the title on it.
Well, Simon & Schuster, who I'd always wanted to write for, after I did a Newsweek cover story absolutely ripping apart one of their best-selling authors, David Heyman, and showing that he had done for them a series of books that just had made-up nonsense in them, to my utter surprise, wanted to publish a book by me about how Trump was doing 1 year in. And so it was tremendous deadline pressure, because there wasn't much to write about until roughly July of 2017, and I had to turn the book in by Labor Day. But this book is about how the people I call political termites have been placed throughout the government by the Trump administration. And they are doing what Trump during the campaign promised he was going to do, which is destroy our federal government. Steve Bannon put it best. He said, we're going to deconstruct the administrative state. But they have set out, to get rid of scientists, to get rid of managers. There's one guy I write about at length who was a very highly rated throughout his career manager in Interior, a real problem solver, highly respected by everybody we could find. And he wouldn't bow to their demands, so now he's a $160,000 a year clerk processing oil royalty checks from the Alaska oil field.
So I just, hi David, it's so great to see you.
Hi, Kimberly.
I tell people the reason why normally I have a great wardrobe for business, and I wear it on the TV show, but I also have a wardrobe for when I have to deal with the IRS. That's with attorneys with the IRS is this. But and that's why I wear this, is to kind of express myself, that I don't have to say anything. But generally, I do have a business wardrobe that I wear on the show. But I just wanted to explain the I have no trust is from my cybersecurity background. I do a lot of cybersecurity speaking, and this is to establish that, you really shouldn't have any trust out there. But with regards to what David just said, you can't even trust the government. So
well, let me raise a trust issue that I was thinking about for something else I'm working on the other day. Bill Maher reported that when the collapse came in 2008, he was a Lehman Brothers a client, and he lost $70 million. If you were a Goldman client and they went out of business, as hard as it is to imagine, had that kind of money, you could lose it all. If you invest at Vanguard, however, which has this unique structure where Vanguard is the trustee and everything is held in trusteed accounts, and the Vanguard itself were to collapse for some reason, your money would be safe. It's an interesting point about how we set up arrangements through which you own your securities and things. And Vanguard's position, which results in much lower fees to them, you don't get rich as a big Vanguard guy. When Jack Bogle died, he was worth tens of millions of dollars, not billions of dollars like Ted Johnston. But it also meant that you're totally secure because all those stock certificates are held by a third-party trustee.
Right. Yeah. A different structure. But that whole issue of the fee structure, David, and what people make in terms of professionally money managers has now come out with a fiduciary rule, and at least it relates into the retirement planning area. It was struck down by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce versus the Department of Labor. Now they're trying to bring it back up, and we've been monitoring the fiduciary rule for quite some time because it's my business to do it. And the thing is, it for financial advisors, it can create some problems. In other words, a lot of insurance companies actually pulled out of our market because they didn't want to be subject to the fiduciary rule. What do you see in terms of this fiduciary rule heading toward? Are we going to have a fiduciary rule for all the people that are investing in the United States?
Yeah, I think when we get a new Congress, we're going to see a much more serious fiduciary rules. And years ago, when I was still reporting at the New York Times, we had one of these off-the-record sessions that I never like to go to because they're off the record. But I went to this one, and the argument was being made that you don't want to be a fiduciary, and it's really pretty horrible for the business. And I challenged our guest quite directly about why, and he said, well, you could get sued. And I said, you can get sued over anything. That's not an argument. What's your objection to the fiduciary rule? So I came home that night to ask my wife, who is a walking, talking fiduciary in charge of $500 million of charitable funds at the public community foundation that she runs, and said, tell me something. You've been a fiduciary almost our entire life. How has it harmed us? And she said, not at all. And I said, well, why would you not want to be a fiduciary? And she said, well, the only reason not to be a fiduciary is if you want to cheat your clients now and then. And if you never intend to cheat your clients, then I don't see a problem. And I've always thought that's sort of exactly right. If you're never going to put your interests ahead of your clients, if you're never going to cheat the client, then what's to worry about?
Right.
And you're also, because you're a fiduciary, going to behave more thoughtfully and carefully.
Right. But the thing is, a lot of the financial industry is based off a commission-based structure, and you can make more by selling products that have a larger commission or fee in a lot of cases than you can on another product. I have to deal with this almost every day with my 1,200 producers that are out there. I used to have 2,000, but 700 we just got rid of because they don't really adhere to those rules, so it becomes a real big problem, because I've got producers going, wait a minute, if I sell this product, I get paid more, even though the product's worse for the client, but it's great for me. And then if I sell the product that you're recommending, my commissions are less, and yeah, it's better for the client, but not for me. How do you deal with that?
Well, you deal with it by making clear that you have to put the client first, and you get rid of the arbitration system, where you as an individual investor may have one case in your life, but the company will have many cases. And so the privately paid arbiters know which side their bread is buttered on. In one of my books, I think it's the third in my trilogy, The Fine Print, I tell about a woman in her 80s, had never married, had no children, had started investing in San Diego real estate during World War II, when she was a secretary for the military. And she ended up worth, I don't know, some millions of dollars. And her broker retires, so she goes to another broker, and the guy immediately puts her in a whole bunch of very high commission, high risk products, and about 80% of her money disappears. And the arbiter said she wasn't entitled to anything, basically. And that's the kind of reason you need to have fiduciary rules about putting yourself first. Whether we see this everywhere, you're involved in the insurance products, but during the housing mortgage scandal in America at Countrywide, which did 20% of all the mortgages.
Totally familiar with that, right?
They had salespeople who were told, well, if you do a regular conventional 30-year mortgage for somebody, you get a $500 fee, but if you do this other mortgage, you get $1,500 to a $5,000 fee.
Right.
And so they steered all sorts of people who were qualified for conventional low-rate mortgages into these toxic products. And it was all driven by the fee structure. And what happened at the end of the day to Angelo Mazzillo, the guy behind all of this, even despite all the evidence that they fabricated documents and they pressured the government to drop underwriting rules, they had what they called arts and crafts rooms where they made up documents. He was fined $647 million, and apparently all of it or almost all of it was paid by the director and officer's insurance company.
So he walked.
They represented them. So he walked. He got away with this stuff.
Right.
And so I do think when we get a new Congress in America, you're going to see a big emphasis on fiduciary rules. I am, in my own life, I have three little pensions I earned from the LA Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, and the New York Times. The Philadelphia Inquirer pension was the best funded newspaper pension in the country. I was the head of the union when we negotiated it, totally protected. It's now going to collapse. Because when the paper was sold, they converted it from a single employer plan to a multi-employer plan. 80% of the guarantee went away, and they didn't put in the right amount of money, and they did some other things, and there's a mobbed-up union that now runs it.
Right.
I just noticed that my LA Times pension plan now belongs to Next Star Communications, a television company, and suddenly it's drifting down on its not being fully employed. And what did Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice, say just recently in a fiduciary case?
Yes.
Where people in a pension that failed wanted to sue.
That was Stoll versus U.S. Bank.
So, yes, thank you. Stoll versus U.S. Bank. And Kavanaugh's opinion, and you're the lawyer here. If I'm doing injustice to his language, let me know. But he basically said, hey, you don't have any standing to sue.
That's correct.
And more importantly, you have no issue because your pension is guaranteed. Well, he hasn't, clearly Kavanaugh hasn't read the guarantee.
The PBGC is not fully guaranteed.
Yeah, In the case of the pension I have at the Philadelphia Inquirer, I've got about a 50% guarantee. At the LA Times, my guarantee would be about 85%.
Right. A lot of people don't know that. They go, oh, my plan's covered by the PBGC, but the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation does not cover 100% of your pension benefits in the United States.
And it's a fixed amount that erodes over time with inflation. So you have somebody who's 80 in good health, likely to live to be 95, and you cut 15 to 50% of their pension, and you've created real economic hardship for them. Yeah. And in the meantime, the executives who underfunded the pension, the company reported larger profits than it would have otherwise. Yep. That made their stock options more valuable, especially if they put the money into buying back stock.
That is 100% correct. What you just said has been a big fraud on America for years, David, that people aren't discussing.
It's interesting because I learned more about the heinous crimes committed against humankind through David and on this show than I do on law enforcement.
Because white collar crime is 100 times greater than regular crime in terms of finance. 100.
Yeah, I mean, we need to replace a lot of our cops with social workers and forensic accountants.
Forensic accountants. Yeah, you need to have a SWAT team.
Because I was trying to hire one. Do they exist?
I'll just jump in and just say a couple of things here, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Firstly, when we talk about company directors, remember that legally speaking, they are required to maximize their shareholders' value.
No, they're not. Not in America. That's not the law in America at all, Shakeel. That's a widely believed thing. It's not true.
Okay.
Not America.
The duty of a shareholder is the same duty a parent has to a child. A corporation has no conscience. It is an empty vessel. And your duty is to take care of the entity, not the shareholder. So if your company's paying a 5% dividend and you're the chairman of the board and you say, gee, we got to stop making widget A and put all of our money we were paying in dividends into creating widget B, or we're going to go out of business and we're going to have to stop the dividend. That's your fiduciary duty. This misbelief comes from an article written by Milton Friedman in 1971 in the New York Times Magazine. Lynn Stout, who died recently, who is a professor of business law at UCLA and then at Cornell, wrote a wonderful book about this, The Myth of Shareholder Value. And when I interviewed Lynn for Reuters, when I was the global economics columnist, we did a 9-minute straight through, no cut taped interview. She had a great line. She said, who goes to an economist for legal advice? But there's a case in America called Dodge Brothers versus Ford. And I know that everybody, what you're saying, Shakeel, I've had CEOs, bank heads tell me this, and it's not what the law is. The law is your duty is solely and exclusively to the welfare of the entity, not to the shareholders.
David, did you finish your question?
Sorry, you are correct in what you say, David. However, if we're going to start quoting Milton Friedman, he used to say something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing, something along the lines of, nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as they spend their own. Let me put a proposition to you, okay? I own 20% or 15%, I'm not sure what the levels are in America. Let's say I own 15% of XYZ company, and I appoint, because I'm entitled to a board seat, but I'm not going to sit on the board myself. So I tell you that I'm going to put you on the board. And I want you to vote a certain way on certain issues. You have to do what I've said because I'm the shareholder that put you there.
Right.
Or resign.
Or resign. That's right. Now, when it comes to having a fiduciary responsibility to clients and to people, I personally believe, because I think I have some level of ethics about me, that you should act in the best interest of your clients. But let's talk about what happened back in the 2008 debacle that happened over there. It wasn't just widespread fraud that occurred at some of these mortgage originators. A lot of this happened because government wanted the Fed and wanted Alan Greenspan to make sure that owning a home in America was available to everybody. And so they relaxed the rules immensely. That in and of itself didn't cause the problem. It was all the derivatives trading that occurred around that caused the problem.
Shakeel, I would agree with you with one adjustment. And there's a document you can download to the internet at Stanford University. It is the record of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, FCIC, at stanford.edu, and you'll find it. They only got $10 million, and they were to investigate the meltdown. Nobody's ever shown a single error of any kind in that report. The reduction in underwriting standards was sought by the banks. And then when Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac wouldn't reduce their standards, and they had the smallest losses, they had a much smaller share of their portfolio losses than the others. They came under tremendous pressure. You can go back and read all the news articles about, well, people who own shares of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are going to lose their shirts because they're not getting with the program. And they're not recognizing that, we don't have to have all this underwriting of mortgages.
They were attacked on Fox regularly.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and CNBC. And, there were tough stories about it in the Times and the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. But it was the collapse of the writing standards. And in the middle of all this, a very important thing happened. In, I I think it was March of 2006, somewhere about that time, the FBI announced that they were investigating this problem with mortgage fraud. And the mortgage fraud they were looking at was fraud by people against banks, people who borrowed money by claiming income to qualify for mortgages that they clearly couldn't qualify for. And the FBI statement, which I have in one of my books, I quote in full, said that there are only two kinds of mortgage fraud, and both of them were by customers against the banks. At no point did the FBI ever accept that there was fraud by the banks against everybody else. And Bill Black, the American business regulator, banking regulator, who brought about over 3,000 indictments, over 1,000 high-level bankers with felony convictions, and almost 900 of them went to prison in the savings and loan scandal 30 years ago. He tried to show the Obama administration how to address this. Eric Holder went around, it was a story I broke in Newsweek back then. Eric Holder went around for 10 months saying there were all these big cases they were going to bring, and they had all this corruption going on. And he had been told to his face by the Inspector General's office, that's not true. And he kept saying it for 10 months. So I can say, therefore, he lied through his teeth and knew better. And in the end of the day, one person was convicted. And his conviction was overturned on appeal. This was really a problem of corruption by banking and the regulators dropping the underwriting, but the pressure to do it was far less about qualifying minority owners. There was some of that. What the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission report shows is that was a little piece of it that's been blown up in the news. The real piece of it was the pressure by Angelo Mazzillo and other bankers to say, we don't need to do underwriting. And no one has ever found a single factual error in that report, which is a doorstop to read. I read it, but it is not what most people understand, and it's because of bad reporting. Lots of bad journalism about this.
How do you think, though, that if you get a new Congress, one that you would like to see, that stronger fiduciary rules would assist? Because so far in my experience, but for very, very few exceptions, more rules and more regulations tend to make things more difficult. And if I can just give you an example, which is not completely relevant to your country, here I am in Australia running roughly the equivalent of what you guys would call a hedge fund overseas, okay? But I personally am not allowed to invest in my own fund because I'm not sophisticated enough to know the risks that my fund is taking.
Yeah.
This is clearly absurd, but these are the kinds of rules that we end up with, because you end up with blanket rules that apply to everybody without there ever being any mechanism for people to look at something and say, in this particular circumstance, this rule being applied would not give us the result that was intended.
Shakeel, let me ask one question,
go ahead,
and then I'll bow out because I really want to hear you two talk. But, I say we're not over-regulated so much as we're insanely regulated. These regulations make no sense. They're illogical. And so if we could have sane regulations, as David is asking us to have, they may apply and they may not have that crazy effect that you just described.
Perhaps, but for that to happen, I would make this suggestion. For you to have sane regulations and sane legislation, not just in America, but all over the world, one of the first things that I think government should start doing is to start looking through laws that are already on the books that do not need to be there anymore. Up until very recently, if you went to a bar in Sydney, in the middle of Sydney City, that bar was required to adjust your horse and provide that horse with hay and water. Okay? Now, I'm not suggesting that Sydney is the size of, say, New York, but it's probably, I don't know, bigger than Atlanta or something like that. I mean, that law, that's absurd. There is no reason for that law to still be there. If you're talking about like Delta Ladner, they still have a 9 o'clock curfew. Why? So it's about time government starts to roll back those rules before they start talking about creating new ones.
Shakeel, listen, I agree with you about this. And for 8 years, I taught regulatory law at Syracuse University's law school. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm well known for my understanding of law. And one of the courses I taught was the business regulatory law of the ancient world as a way to understand why is it the way it is today. And one of the things that's happened in America is, first of all, when the progressive movement got going 120 years ago, there was this belief that if you just got the rules finely diced enough, you would solve problems. It is the regulatory equivalent of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It was a nutty idea. What you want are broad rules that are easily enforced and that at the same time are flexible. And of course, all good rules have mercy provisions because there are things that we can't anticipate will happen for good faith conduct that may not fit the rule perfectly. We need to not only go through and eliminate laws like that. I think Ohio still has a law in the books that if you drive a car at night, you have to stop every 100 feet, set off a rocket, and then you can go forward 100 feet or something stupid like that. It's a famous dumb law for when horseless carriages first appeared. But we also need to make laws line up. So I wrote recently and talked on the show a few weeks ago about how almost all the coffee and chocolate consumed in America is produced by either slaves or children, and or economic slaves, if not literal slaves. Those products are contraband in the United States. So why isn't anything done about it? Why don't we seize a ship? Well, it's because Congress passed one set of laws for the U.S. Department of Labor, and then there's another one for Customs and Border Enforcement, and they don't match up. They miss. And we need to go through and make things work on a comprehensive basis. And then we need to focus on what are the most important things to regulate and not these super fine details. And a good fiduciary rule that can be enforced without arbitration, which favors the industry over the individual who will have 0 or 1 cases in their life, is an important step in that direction. So, but we need fundamental rethinking of our tax system, which I've talked a lot about in the show. In my next book, we'll propose an entirely new national tax system that Australia could use, any modern country could use. Slight adaptations, but the principles will work everywhere. And we need to fundamentally review regulation. Now, when I go out and give a lecture to college before the pandemic about this, I had to very sharply limit how much I said about it because pretty soon you'd have an audience going, even though to their pocketbooks it's critical. Because the nuts and bolts, the plumbing of government is something we generally don't care about. And the conservatives who argued years ago, way back to the 50s, the regulatory capture, that's what I was taught in college in the 60s and the early 70s, where the concentrated interest of the industry leads it to find ways to capture that regulatory agency so it operates as a shield, not as a sword for the consumer. We got to figure out how to change that, how to undo that. But these are things we're capable of doing if we have the political will to do them.
But you need that political will.
Well, you also, it's not just the political will. It takes a lot of money. People don't understand the coordination that it takes to go up and make these changes. It's like
he also mentioned something very important, which was the arbitrators having a conflict of interest. And I had a case before the American Arbitration Association. Why did we go before them? Well, they were recommended as AAA.
Great book.
Standing.
Great book.
I wrote a book on it. The arbitrator, David, no lie, had a relationship with our defendant. For 3 years, they even owned his home. This is the state of Washington, a purported liberal state. They owned the guy's home. And we lost the case, obviously. And then,
I'm shocked.
I'm shocked. And by the way, he embezzled $140,000 from one of my companies. Okay, so that's the reason we went there. And I was going like, what's the story here? And the thing is, we found out that he knew about the fact his law firm had owned the guy's home, was the trustee of his properties, but he decided just not to disclose it, which he's required to do by law on the disclosure form. Now, how did he get off after we filed a complaint with the Washington Bar? His former partner was the head of the Washington Bar Association. End of case.
So,
okay, end of case. And that's the reality of law in America for people who know what they're doing.
I want to
That's
just
how you
add
win those
this,
cases.
and the judges get mad at me when I walk into a courtroom, and my first question is, I want to clear out whether anyone's from the same wood pile before we get started in this small town in North Carolina, and I get chewed out for bringing that up.
That was one of many cases. Unfortunately, this one really hit home, and I took the case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. We lost because it was a technical reason, but we won because they all folded after that. After they realized I was willing to drag them through every court for the next decade, which is what I did. I
thought it was better than
I said, look,
lawyer, but somebody died in your book. So that's the reason why your book didn't make it to the movies.
Well,
nobody died in your book.
What's the book called? What's the book called? I
don't advertise it because there's another rule which people don't know about. Okay, well, the reason I don't advertise or promote all
WashingtonLawyer.com.
Because here's the reason. It disparages the legal profession, and I'm still a member of the Florida Bar. Technically, I cannot disparage the legal profession. Okay, and
yes, that's why I'm glad I teach law, but I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, right. This is a real problem. If you make a
decision, your First Amendment rights should not prevent you from being able
to leave your First Amendment rights on the table. Yes. Remember, when you get admitted to a bar association, you still have your First Amendment rights, but you do not have the right to practice law if you disparage the legal profession. So you get to keep your free speech as a layman. That's the rule.
It's the way
I personally think, as it's not American, I personally think that should be constitutionally challenged. But before I get to
great, Shakeel. I'll spend the rest of my life arguing that in front of all the courts.
I'd like to ask David a question, though, and it's a question that goes to the heart of what you were talking about with fiduciary responsibilities. I just want to move a little bit away from the banking sector and the finance sector and talk about an issue which is affecting a big part of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and of course you guys in the United States. We have an aging population. We have a lot of people now who are relying on their children to be their powers of attorney, to be their enduring guardians or something similar to that. And once those sorts of mechanisms are in place, it's very difficult for those people to actually get control back of their own assets. Now, this has become a problem. It's not talked about too much in the media yet, but it's a problem. And our aging population is getting older. That's why they're called an aging population. If we're going to talk about fiduciary responsibilities at banks, I think we really have to talk about what's happening when a 45 or 50-year-old person starts to get control of their parents' assets. Mm-hmm. And I've heard cases here in Australia and I've heard cases in Canada where, the mum's gone to hospital, has come back and been put into a nursing home because the house has been sold from under her. That's a really serious issue. And how do you fix that? Because you can't spend 10 years in court arguing about it.
I've had those cases. In other words, it's not like I've been practicing for 37 years, so I get cases like that. Here's a true case. Client came to me with $10 million in assets. They had given it all to their kids, basically, to avoid the federal estate tax back then, which was around $600,000 when I started practicing, and it was in a trust. Okay,
the exemption was $600,000.
The exemption was $600,000, right? It was an irrevocable trust. Okay. And so the thing is, then they wanted the assets back, and the kids said, no, they're mine now. So they filed suit against their children in the state of Wisconsin. It said John Jones Irrevocable Trust. They went before the right judge, and the judge says, irrev, well, that's a Scrivener's error. IRV, I'm going to strike it, make it a revocable trust, and send the money back to the parents.
Well, good for you and for the parents.
That may have happened in that case, but does that happen to the person?
No, but see, the thing is, there's Law 101. I always tell my students there's Law 101. That's what the law says. Law 102 is how it's actually practiced or what the judge says. Yeah. That's a totally different law.
There's a real issue there, Shakeel. And one of the things we have in America going on in mostly poorer neighborhoods is taking people's houses. So you're a blue-collar worker, you've paid your house off, you own it free and clear, and somebody forges documents and puts a mortgage on your house and absconds with the money. And the courts, surprisingly, have not been particularly supportive of the homeowners. This has been shocking. We've had a number of cases where the courts have said, well, you should have spoken up or you should have known or something like that. And sometimes these are people who are elderly, not entirely with it. And you can't do that kind of crime without somebody on the inside. There has to be at least one person somewhere to get the documents through. Law and Order did a really good episode about it. And it turns out in America, in that particular case, by the way, there's a simple solution to that. You put a HELOC on your house, a home equity line of credit, because if somebody tries to put a mortgage on your house, your HELOC bank gets in touch with you immediately and says, what's going on here?
Right.
And you have to get them to approve the new deal. You could still get around it. But this fundamental notion of what do we do about trustees for elderly people who may or may not have their mental acuity, or who may temporarily not have it because they're, say, hospitalized, that's a real problem. And I don't see in the law review literature, I read at least one law review article a week, I don't see anything in the literature that tells me there's serious discussion of how to reform these laws about trustee relationships for elder Americans. And that's actually very surprising to me.
And I can tell you that I didn't see that, not that I studied the law anywhere near as much as you do, but I can tell you I did not see anything like that anywhere in Europe when I was there. Certainly I don't see it in Australia or New Zealand either. And these are the sorts of issues that I say I get quite frustrated when the people who are supposed to be our elected representatives don't bother to deal with issues that really do have effects on people, but instead use their time in Parliament or in Congress to have petty arguments with each other about things that really have very little effect on the everyday person's lives. I think that's disappointing, and I think that
you're right. You're right. But see, financial stuff is boring. See, there's another problem with this, and one thing that David pointed out, which I've been following for years, but I've seen no study on it. The compensation of executives is based on stock options. One of my clients was the president of a company called Kimberly-Clark. It's actually a fairly big company in the United States. Kimberly-Clark. Anyway, the president was one of my clients. The founder of Dunkin' Donuts was one of my clients. I had a good stable of nice clients back when I was practicing. And his compensation was through this thing called stock options. So I got to review his stock options. And so his goal was to drive up the shareholder stock so he could exercise his option and retire, which is what he did. The problem is that pensions, which is what David was discussing, is an expense. It's deductible, but it's an expense. So they have a choice to do a maximum fund, a target, or a minimum. They go to the minimum, so they put very little money into their pension account, and then they distribute the assets to their shareholders, bringing up the value of their stock options, and they do this to the pension. So, and what happens, a lot of states that people live in right now, their pension states and even the private system, they're underfunded. Some of them go under, and people don't receive their full benefits because what David pointed out quite correctly, the PBGC does not cover full benefits.
So, Nick, let me tell you the solution I proposed to this and see if you think it makes sense.
Sure.
When you have a defined contribution plan, like a 401k plan, the company puts the money into the plan, and the company can go broke tomorrow. It doesn't matter. They've turned it over into a separate trustee plan.
Sure, right.
Well, pension plans for single employer plans are an asset of the company.
Correct.
In fact, at one point, the phantom assets of the GM pension plan were 120% of the net worth of GM. This is back around 2004.
Yeah, it could be, right.
So what I propose is that the defined benefit pension plan should be a separate trustee account that is not the company's property. And the only thing the company reports in its consolidated financial statement and in the financial summary statement is a one-line item. So there's net operations profits, reserve for income taxes, which is what we should call it because it's not income taxes actually paid.
Right.
Net profit, and then it should be shortfall, if any, to pension plan.
Right. They call the net amortization shortfall amount.
Yeah, and that way you know whether they put enough money in the plan, and the company doesn't get to pick the numbers.
Right.
The estimates of what's going on. It's independently done.
Have the actuary pick the number.
Okay. Right. And so then what happens is the company can no longer dip into it. If they underfund it, the shareholders are warned. And you add to that a clawback provision. If there's trouble later, the company can be forced to pay it back and put it at the top of the priority list, or allow a court to say you can't exercise any stock options until you bring this thing up to zero.
That would have more effect than anything. In other words, you can't exercise your bloody stock options until you have your pension money.
My point is that the fundamental structure of the way we do things has a lot to do with Shakeel's point, which is a very well-made point. But a lot of times the law is actually contrary to the interests we have. And the reason that politicians do what you suggest, Shakeel, is they're like everybody else. They respond to incentives. So what is the incentive to lawmakers? Make your biggest donors happy. Even if you can't get them what they want, do things that make you think you're fighting for them. And if you got a bunch of donors who say, I hate unions, well, then get out there and pound on unions, even if you're not going to do anything substantial, because that's how they respond, the same way that salespeople respond to changes in their compensation based on sales volume and the products they sell.
Right. But David, I have a question, and that is these pension systems worked in my parents' generation, and they're not working for my generation. So what happened?
Well, we allowed the companies to pick their rate of return and to book phantom profit. So if you said we're going to earn 8% in our pension plan, which is a pretty high rate of return for anybody over the long haul, and you actually earn 3%, for a rolling 60-month period, you're showing 5 percentage points a year of profits you don't have. And then the piper comes due in the future. And the solution to that is this is one of these areas of maybe you could argue excessive regulation. But in a pension plan, and I wrote about this in the New York Times, I think 25 years ago, 1995, in a pension plan, for every worker, they calculate, here's how much money on this person's pay we have to put away this year for when they turn 65. The Democrats put in a provision in the law around 1993 to squeeze a little bit of extra tax revenue that said you can only contribute to a plan up to $240,000 at age 65. So you're a $100,000 a year employee and you're 30. When they project out your future income at 65, it's going to be $1 million a year, let's say. So they can only put 1/4 of the amount of money needed for your pension into the plan because you're going to hit $1 million at the end and you can only cover $240,000. That's cockamamie crazy. That's just nuts. And I believe that the solution to this, and I tried to get this when I was the head of the newspaper guild, Philadelphia Inquirer, where I got dragooned into being head of the union and negotiating a contract. I wanted a line item on your paycheck. Gross pay, federal income tax, Social Security, Medicare, contribution to pension plan, which at the time was 6% of pay and $15 per head, whether you were full-time or part-time. So there'd be a line item there and you'd see how much money they put away and they would have to actually put it away. And because you see that when it's a match for your 401k, your defined contribution plan, we should follow the same kind of rule. But it's not working basically because we've allowed a very sophisticated form of wage theft. A pension is just wages you deferred into the future, and we have allowed sophisticated wage theft. And it's part of the fundamental reforms we need to make, but it's really hard to get. I mean, I go to union halls, UAW, IBEW, places like that, and this just goes way over the heads of these guys because that's not their life. They didn't go to college, study economics. Even if they're IBEW or machinists, who have to work with numbers, this is not their kin. They're not dumb. Just listen to them talk about a sports play and how brilliantly they can take apart the fine details of it and the big strategy. But they don't have any background with which to judge these things. And it's very hard to get them to understand it matters.
Well, you don't have the background to understand that you've been screwed. And that's the problem is that they throw all these fancy things up there and say, this is what the law says. And I've even watched big corporations do this where they literally misrepresent every part of the law to the people with lawyers telling them this, and they believe them because they think, well, there's no way this lawyer is going to lie to me. And then they just, and serious. And then they just take everything away. Kind of like the first time I ever got laid off. I'll never forget this. They had a lawyer come in and sit down and, tell me all of these things. And at that point, I really wasn't listening until he said, and by the way, you cannot go out and talk to any media. You can't do this. You can't do that. You can't do this. And, if you do, we're going to take your check away from you, your last check. And I looked at everyone in the room and I go, did I not just hear I don't work for you anymore? And they go, yeah. And I go, and you're telling me? But they do this to everybody. They bully you with these laws that don't exist. I've even been known to get into faces of lawyers at MCI and tell them that they'll lose their degree if they ever lie like that again, and they did. But they do that. They misrepresent and they twist it and they use the loopholes, just like they did with a lot of IBM employees and took away their pensions. People who
You're
were
thinking about the case
Zero.
versus IBM for those
case, you know who got all the money from that case?
lawyers.
140 million went to lawyers, and 3 million went to the people who lost their pension.
Right. Well, all it does say that having a law degree is worth something, at least in the United States of America. But
they should be. I don't want to get arrested if they are.
What David says, a lot of the laws are driven by the PACs in Washington, D.C. I actually did kind of volunteer work for one of the PACs up in D.C., so I got to meet all the senators, got to write them checks, got them to do things, same with congressmen. It was kind of an interesting experience. I had no idea, but they listened to PACs and PAC money. With that, the new act, the Secure Act very favors annuities. As a matter of fact, General Motors bought $29 billion of annuities from Prudential to fund their pension and get it off their balance sheet. So we've seen that. But if you ever go through the Secure Act right now, it's all about buying annuities, which are basically insurance contracts.
And getting rid of the pension benefit guarantee in doing so.
That's correct. The PBGC will be out of the picture because you're going to rely on the insurance company to make sure that the payments are being made. Now, with that being said, you could make an argument the insurance companies in the United States are stronger financially than other financial institutions because they just passed this recent where you have to do these principle-based reserves for insurance companies. And so the thing is, financially, Prudential and a lot of these insurance companies are very strong, but we saw with the economic downturn that took place, AIG almost went under because they were the ones that were actually taking like a quarter of a point to guarantee all those mortgages, and they thought it was free money. They were going like, this is stupid. You're going to pay me to insure your mortgages and I'll charge a quarter of a point. And they just kept pocketing it, not realizing that all of a sudden there could be an explosion and lose all the mortgages, which when AIG collapsed, they were so embedded and reinsured all these other insurance companies, it would have been a domino effect. All the companies would have gone up.
Back during the Mike Milken junk bond era, a bunch of the textile companies, Cannon Mills among them, bought annuities from companies that were junk bond funded insurers, and they failed. And my colleague, Mary Williams Walsh, who I offloaded the pension coverage and bankruptcy coverage to, she did this piece about textile workers who were supposed to get very modest pensions, $122 a month. Right. And they ended up with pensions of like literally $2.78 a month because the PBGC guarantee was gone. And this was a Milken funded insurance company that was all air. And we need to have some kind of clawback provisions to go back after people and institutions who do this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court's position in a case called Verity, which is the old Massey Agricultural Implements Company, Verity said, unless you can prove the executives knew they were going to deny you benefits or had underfunded them so badly they knew it was going to fail, you have no case.
Right. Yeah.
And so, you get a bunch of opinions, this will all work, you pay for them, and now you're protected. And that's, no, we need to stop that kind of the stuff.
So David, okay, I all of a sudden become an American right now. I move across to America. You're in charge. You've given me those rules. You've said to me that you can have all these clawback provisions, et cetera, the stuff that you've just said. Do I have the right to at all question you as government about some of the promises that you've made in relation to the Social Security obligations that you have, in relation to Medicare obligations that you have, et cetera, that can only realistically be paid? It can only realistically be paid by you guys either indebting your future generations or by inflating your currency.
Okay, so two things. I'm right now writing.
Back from some of those, Pollies.
Yeah. I think those are separate issues. But more importantly, let me just point out something. The only reason Social Security in the United States, which has a huge surplus, has a problem is that we went from the Reagan era rule of taxing 90% of wages to applying the Social Security tax to only about 81% of wages. And if we went back to the Reagan rule and if we kept it in place, there would be no issue. So long as you have a even steady state economy, we can afford Social Security. And this book I'm writing the introduction of the new version of it for actually calls for what I think we need, which is a substantial expansion of Social Security benefits in the United States. It is silly to think about Social Security the way the right in America has gotten it to be examined, and that is to an infinity horizon. We don't measure anything to an infinity horizon. What we need to know is what's the funding. Even out 30 years, you're getting to be very speculative. But there's no reason we can't afford it. In New Zealand, short opt from you in Oz, they have a very simple national pension plan that everybody is in. And you get a set amount of money, and then the difference among people is how much is withheld from your check for taxes because they tax it. They could just do it the other way around and say, I'm going to lower your check and you're not going to pay any taxes. But there's no reason you can't fund a universal retirement plan. Does Australia still have its universal plan where 5% of all your wages go into the plan?
New Zealand has a flat tax of 30%, including capital gains. They did used to have an exemption on capital gains, but they've got that flat. Australia has what we call a superannuation fund. It's similar to pension funds or 401ks over there. Depending on your employer, I think the minimum's 9%, but some employers will pay up to 13% into those industry super funds. Now, I'll just say something very quickly here. I got myself into a little bit of trouble back in my more arrogant days. I was at one of the finance expos, and I was in a room of people who were nearing retirement age. And I said to them, when I was younger, I was told that there was two big things in your life, the two biggest investments that you'll ever have. One is going to be the home that you buy, the home that you live in. And the second is going to be your superannuation fund, your pension fund. Those are going to be the two biggest things you're going to have. The home and, of course, the pension fund, because that's going to be what carries you through from retirement age until the time that you die. Does everybody agree with that? Everybody said yes. I said we have a thing here called self-managed super funds where people are actually allowed to manage their own pension money. So I said, to those of you that manage your own, this question doesn't apply to you. For everybody else, if you have a pension fund or superannuation fund or anything similar to that, this is your life savings. This is one of the two most important financial things that you have in your life. Please put your hand up if you can tell me the name of the person who makes the investment decisions over your life savings. And of course, not one person could. Now, it's a cheap shot.
I can tell you here in America.
Right? I know it's a cheap shot, but the vast majority of people all over the world have absolutely no idea who's actually managing their pension money.
But the pension scheme in the U.S., Shakeel, is not a savings plan. It's a pay-as-you-go plan that has a huge surplus because we overtaxed people in the 80s and 90s. And at one point, I've shown that the excess tax that was collected explains the entire collapse of private savings during that period of time. The government collected more tax, people had less capacity to save because it was more tax. And at the same time, remember, in the US, by decimating unions, we pushed down labor's share of the economy. If we hadn't done that, Social Security would have money running out its ears right now.
That's assuming what you said before, which was that you would have a relatively stable economy. But we've seen a much more globalized world today. We've seen a race to the bottom in taxation across the world, especially on corporate taxes. So if you were to maintain higher rates of tax, that would theoretically fund the Social Security benefits that you're talking about. That may also have the effect of driving some jobs to other countries that are more competitive.
But we discussed that it was doubtful. I think you even said that people are going to leave just because they're paid more taxes. They're going to stay at their own house. Now, one problem we also have in our Social Security,
people might not leave.
Right.
People might leave.
Or money
Companies might leave.
Companies might leave. Where does Google pay tax? Where does Amazon pay tax?
Well, Google, as we well know, sold their search engine to their Irish company and leased it back. So the thing is, even though they say we do no evil, well, what's more evil than escaping all taxation in the United States? I mean,
Amazon taxing, right? Yeah.
Tell me, Mr. Silicon Valley dude, what's more evil than that?
I have to excuse myself, but I do have a couple of statements before I leave. And one is, Shakeel, if you ever decide to move to the United States, you're going to have to improve your American. Because
we're going to have to work on you.
And Nick, for you, I say you should write the book Financial Fitness for Dummies.
Financial Fitness for Dummies.
And I'm going to write the book American for Dummies.
I think David is a better writer. David's one.
These are all the things you need to know before you move here.
Well, greetings, Jeff Brown, and I must take my leave. So you carry on.
Jeff Brown will carry on as
I'll tell a very
leaves.
quick story for Jim's benefit, so he'll be able to watch this in the replay. So when I got to America, the very first time I got to America, I was driving around everywhere trying to, try out all the different fast foods because we don't have them all in Australia. So I was trying to find all these different places. And I was hunting around, driving around in circles, wrong side of the road, trying to find this famous place called Mickey D's. Because I'd heard all about this Mickey D's. And I thought, this Mickey D's sounds fantastic. And I'm hunting all over. I mean, I went across 9 different states looking for the restaurant, couldn't find it. Walk into a McDonald's, my friends are sitting there, and I'm like, I give up. Where on earth is this Mickey D's place? And they said, you realize you're actually in one, right? We call it Macca's over here in Australia. So I thought Mickey D's was a whole new experience. It was not the same thing.
It's one of our greatest exports. We want to destroy a country. We just send them Mickey D's. For those who've just joined us, we have Kim Calhoun, who is with IBM TV, sits on the board of advisors at North Carolina State Computer Science Department, and Kit, who actually runs IBM TV out of New Delhi, who's a director for IBM TV. We have Shakeel, who's actually a international money manager, owns his own money management company, will always do the disclaimer before he tells you anything. David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize winner, New York Times bestseller, The Making of Trump, among other books like Perfectly Legal, and also teaches at Syracuse University Law School. We have Alexander Starr, who runs Chess Stars and also runs our investing, and our special guest, Jeff Brown, who's the dean of the University of Illinois College of Business. And I just recently saw that there was a problem where there's some rule, we were talking about legal rules, that they're going to take all your international students and send them back home. What's going on there?
Well, this administration is not doing higher ed any favors. Let me just put it that way. Look, we've got 10,000 international students at the University of Illinois across all of our colleges, graduate and undergraduate. And while that's a high number compared to most of the universities, most universities have international students. We do it for a variety of reasons, right? Part of it is we really believe it adds to the intellectual environment for our domestic students to get a global perspective. Partly it's because we have an incentive to attract some of the best and brightest people in the world. And given that the US is only 5% of the world population, we certainly don't have a monopoly on intellectual talent. And we believe that by bringing folks from around the world here, many of them stay here and go on and start businesses. And we'd rather start them here than go some other country and compete against us. So we're a little frustrated that last week the Trump administration announced that if a student is enrolled at a U.S. university and that U.S. university goes online this fall, that they are not allowed to stay here on their student visa, that they will have to leave the country. And this is a significant source of stress and anxiety. Frankly, it's, I think I've used the word cruel before. It's cruel to the students. It's harmful to the universities. At Illinois, we're in a pretty good spot in the sense that we are going to be hybrid this fall anyway. We're inviting everyone back to campus, and we're going to socially distance and have a mix of face-to-face and online classes. But look, if this pandemic continues to get worse, we can't rule out that we might determine that from a public health perspective, the best thing to do is to go remote again. Or look at schools like Harvard or Cal State, who've already decided to go online before this announcement came out.
Is Harvard going to lose all their international students?
Well, they're going to have, Harvard is either, so first of all, they filed a lawsuit, and good for them for doing so.
Yeah, right.
But if they don't get a stay, then they've got a choice to make. Either their students are all going to be here illegally if they stay, or they're all going to have to leave, or Harvard is going to have to change its mind about how it's going to deliver courses this fall. And it's not just Harvard. I mean, there's dozens, probably hundreds of universities that are in this situation. And every university, including ours, is concerned, well, what happens if we start off on campus and then, like in the spring, for the good of public health, feel like we need to go online for a period of time? What happens to all these students?
So I have a question to ask. What has it hurt having these students here now? What does it hurt keeping them? And doesn't this violate every grain of what America is all about?
I'm just wondering if what he's doing is legal, because this is an executive order as opposed to, it was not legislation.
I wasn't even made aware of this, and oh my God.
Legal?
Oh my God, I missed my state meeting. Oh my God. Oh my God. I've been fighting organized criminals.
I'm sorry to be the one that made you think of that, but I can't answer the question whether it's legal. There's others here that probably have a better legal background than me. I hope it is not. What I can tell you is it's extremely damaging to higher ed, and it's damaging to the U.S. economy. I mean, let's be clear. Immigrants to the U.S. file a disproportionate share of patents. They're innovators. They start companies. If you look at, I saw a number the other day that like 40-something% of S&P 500 companies founders were immigrants, or their children were children of immigrants. I mean, immigrants are what built this, the economy in this country. We almost all of us, unless you're a Native American, we all were immigrants at some point in time. That's what this country's supposed to be about. And it's, and again, I just ask the question all the time of, in what world does it make sense that we are taking some of the best and brightest minds from around the world and telling them, we don't want you here. We want you to go start your business in India or China or Europe or somewhere else, and then compete against us and create those jobs over there.
Right. That's the problem I have. In other words, you're losing out on the best and the brightest. And our chess players know that the best and the brightest are what the best chess player is in Magnus Carlsen in Norway. And then we have one Fabio Caruana in the United States, but we got him to come here to the United States because he was working in Italy. And the whole goal is you want to bring the best and the brightest here, not send them elsewhere. But then my problem is that, can you do this by way of an executive order as opposed to legislation? Because realize, Jeff, he bypasses Congress completely if he can sign an order like this and ship all these people offshore. And I go, can't.
Offered by the White House as to why they were doing this before we attack the legality of it? Was there some sort of rationale, even if we don't agree with it?
I mean, see, here's the thing. I think, Shakeel. Okay, it's to demonize foreigners like China, Russia. We demonize people here all the time for no reason. Okay, so the thing is, but it makes us feel good if we demonize people that aren't from the United States. So there's this demonization deal that's going on there that's supposedly making us feel good. So apparently the demonization is now, hey, you're not from the United States, hence you're a demon. I mean, it's just it's juvenile, really. It's really juvenile.
Having come to your country now on a number of occasions,
right?
I'm not saying that there's no racism that exists in America or Australia. Maybe there is. But I can certainly tell you, and I don't think I'm white, I can't tell you that I've felt demonized by anybody. In fact, when I've been over there, most of the time people are really fascinated because they're not 100% sure what my accent is and where I'm from and that sort of stuff. I've been through, the southern states and northern states, east and west coast. So, bar some of the central states of America, I've been all over your country, and I have never felt demonized.
Yeah, but the people in the United States are good, but then we have this thing called the government.
Well, let me also say, first of all, the fact that you have an Australian accent makes you a little bit more of a curiosity to folks, and they don't view you in the same way. If you were a Black American born here, descended from slaves, I guarantee you face racism every day in this country. Not just at an individual level, but also through 400 years of history. So there's no question about that. The issue with immigration is very abstract, though. Is it a lot of people are very kind to folks as an individual, but from a policy standpoint, they don't want them here. They don't want anymore. It's the other, right? So whether it's the Chinese or the Mexicans or whatever, and that's what's driving this policy. Now, the only explanation I heard that is not just blatant xenophobia or a hatred of higher education, both of which are plausible explanations, is that this was a way to try to force higher educational institutions to return to campus this fall. Many of us are already doing it, but not all universities are. And since the president didn't have the direct ability to order universities to be on campus, this was not even a carrot, it was a stick to try to get them to do so.
This was not a carrot or a stick. This was an electric prod.
but Jeff's analysis, is exactly spot on about the racism. Let's remember Donald Trump, who's been in adjudicated proceedings, found to have done numerous racist acts, has a guy named Stephen Miller, who is high school valedictorian in Santa Monica, California. They stopped his speech because it was a racist screed. At DC Report, we refer to him as Trump's minister of hate. And anything he can do that's xenophobic, Donald listens to. And the only reasons are the two things that Jeff just pointed out. One is the antagonism to education by Donald Trump. And secondly, this fundamental, you're going to go back to school like it or not, because it's a hoax. The whole thing is a hoax. Now, Jeff, let me ask a question. I know that at Syracuse, all of the law students from overseas pay 100% of the full freight. When my seventh child decided to become a lawyer in Canada, I had to pay full freight in Canada. And so I assume your foreign students are high profit items as opposed to the majority of your students who are subsidized, and you hope to make it up with contributions in the future from those who are successful.
Yeah, so it varies by program. For the most part, under U.S. immigration law, students who come to study in the United States have to demonstrate in order to get a visa that they have the financial means to support themselves. And once you've gone through that process, many of them don't qualify for financial aid, and they certainly don't qualify for federal aid and so forth. So it is true that most international students are paying full freight, and usually more than full freight. In other words, an international student will typically pay more than an out-of-state student at a public institution and so forth. And what we do at Illinois is we take a lot of that. Like if I have an international student in the Geese College of Business, they're paying more than a domestic student does. And we take a big part of that differential and we put it into scholarships for Illinois residents. So not only are we hurting the experience, not only are we sort of violating a contract with these international students that are part of our family. I mean, they're part of our community, but we're then imposing additional financial pressure on us, which is going to hurt our ability to provide scholarships to American students who've been, might not have the means to come, but who have demonstrated that they're a good enough student to come here. It's just bad policy all the way around. And I got to tell you, as a dean, I do a lot of fundraising, right? And my alumni span the entirety of the political spectrum, right? I've got everything from the most conservative to the most liberal alum you can imagine. And so I very rarely speak about politics. You won't see me tweeting out stuff, ridiculing our president or things like that. But there are times, and this is one of them, when the administration is enacting policies that are harmful to higher education and are harmful to this college and are harmful to the degrees that my alumni hold, you better believe I'm going to speak out, even if it risks offending some folks, because this is just bad policy.
I concur, Council.
I'm going to
I'm not sure.
You need,
as well.
Whatever you need, let me know. I want to be part of this campaign because I truly believe in, this equal education. Jeff, you and I, we've talked about this, how important it is to cross over these international relationships.
It also
Holmes will agree with this.
Yeah, it gives the foreign students the ability to come here, spend time, get to know the culture, get friends.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of benefits, intangible as well as tangible, to have.
By the way, don't forget that Donald, as a candidate, kept complaining that Barack Obama had relied way too much on executive orders. He issued the fewest executive orders per year of any president since World War II. But that was a big Donald campaign thing. He's a tyrant who is ruling by executive order. And look at Donald, his executive orders.
Donald's the Twitter ruler.
I'm not sure if that's legal. For those who have joined us, we have Kimberly Calhoun, who's the vice chair of the computer science department at North Carolina State University, Ankit in New Delhi, who actually runs the IBM TV network, Shakeel, who's a money manager in Sydney, Australia, David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize winner, New York Times bestseller, teacher at Syracuse Law School, Alexander Starr, who runs Chess Stars and also our investment show on Wednesday, Jeff Brown, the Dean of University of Illinois School of Business, and just joined us, Holmes Stoner, who's the chairman of the International American Chamber of Commerce. I don't know if it's hit you, Holmes. Did you see the rule that was passed that tells all the foreign students they gotta leave the country? Did you see that?
$2 billion a year. Tell her that to go away. Okay, $200 a year for my daughter to go to school at Santa Monica Community College. The Chinese person pays $47,000 for the same exact program. Right. So I ask you, what is the purpose of throwing all of these people out of the country? First of all, hurting our own school systems, and then we've educated them. What do you think they're going to do when they go back to their home country? We've educated them. They're running the government, most of them. Okay, if you look at the last 2 or 3 decades, especially in China that I'm very familiar with, most of the people in the government in China have been educated in Western countries. I don't understand the logic there. I just don't get it.
So I do, in a way, because I don't know if you noticed, but I have an odd way of doing things on Facebook. And most of the time it's for me to understand the human behavior and Trumpettes. I nickname them Trumpettes because they have this unduly admiration for Trump and will follow him even if he starts shooting people in Times Square. But I started looking at some of this stuff, and I noticed it yesterday, which now I understand why they were posting this, the Trumpettes. He's brainwashed them to think that all of these people need to leave because they are hurting our education system. He is brainwashed them to think that all of these people are part of the liberal movement to, ruin everything that they have built. It's all brainwashed, because I was reading it and I go, oh God, what has he done now? Now I know. I know that's the first thing I do when I start seeing these. I go, what has Trump done now?
Well, and then on Friday, he tweeted out,
I'm going to go on a video.
On Friday, he tweeted out that he was asking the Treasury Department to look into the tax-exempt status of U.S. universities because he's afraid they've become hotbeds for liberal thinking. And I can tell you, I worked in the Bush administration, okay? I'm economically, I'm definitely on the conservative side of things. And that narrative is it's wrong. Yes. Faculty in higher ed, there are more Democrats than Republicans, more liberals than conservatives, but it's not like we're these secret cults that are indoctrinating people. We're educating folks and we're teaching them to think, and we're challenging the preconceived views that they come in with, whatever they are. So all of this, I think, is just part of a campaign to unfortunately tear down one of the great American industries. I've said this before.
Education.
We export $40 billion a year of education a year. So we export more education than we do soybeans. We almost as much as we do automobiles, right? It's one of our great export industries, number one, and we're trying to tear it apart. Now, that's a funny way to close a trade deficit if that's one of the things you promised you were going to do. is to tear down one of your leading export industries.
And I agree with you, Jeff. And here's my thing, because you all know I have been saying that we have a 18th century government system with a 19th century education system expecting 21st century results. Well, we've just this thing has set the education system back to the 1600s. If you are removing international crossover relationships and education and removing that connectivity, you have just put us back to the 1600s, as far as I'm concerned.
With one exception, and apologies for the little infomercial here, but we've talked on one of my previous, a couple of my previous appearances here about our online programs. So these were online programs that existed prior to the pandemic. So we have this $22,000 MBA degree fully online. We have $11,000 Master's in Management fully online. Nice thing about those is you don't have to be resident in the United States to do them. So from anywhere in the world, you can earn the degree from Illinois, one of the top business schools in the world. And so technology is obviously quite different than it was in the 1600s. And so in that environment, we're able to have a truly global environment. We have, in our MBA program, we have 100 countries represented now. It's spectacular. So that, at least, I often think, look, this pandemic's been horrible in many, many ways, but I'm so glad it happened in 2020 instead of, the year 2000, before the internet, before Zoom, before the ability to actually migrate a lot of this stuff online and work from home, because we really would have shut down the economy if this had happened 20 years ago.
So what do we need to do besides protesting and stuff like that? Harvard's filed a lawsuit. Right. We need a big voice up there kicking them right now. Like,
amicus briefs.
How do we do this? How do we join? Because this doesn't just affect the U.S. This affects the whole world.
Absolutely.
And so how do we join together? What do we need to do to stop it?
It's in front of the courts now. I mean, like I said, I have a problem with whether or not he has the legal ability to do what he's doing by way of an executive order. I don't work in the immigration law area, so I'm not that familiar with it. I'm sure the people in Harvard will, and I believe the judges probably are not going to side with him. Remember, he lost that case recently with Justice Roberts before the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, hey, look, you can do things like this, pass executive orders like this, but get them rebuked maybe, at the court level. Other than that, without the court system, I think you're kind of toast.
No, I think
amicus briefs is a very good point. We need
amicus briefs would be good, right? In other words, the amicus briefs actually, in the last case I was reading, there was quite a few amicus briefs, and actually attorneys that appeared before the Supreme Court, which usually they don't allow people that file amicus briefs to actually speak before the court, but actually did in some of the cases that went before the Supreme Court. So I don't know how fast it's going to progress through the court system. I just don't see this case, him going anywhere with this.
So I agree. One of the questions I have is, this was actually issued as a regulation from the Immigration Service. I'm not sure it was actually issued as an executive order. I think it was
but still, even if it's a regulation.
Understood. I'm just saying, I don't know how that changes things.
But there's a process for promulgating the rule. You have to have a public comment period.
Right. A public comment period.
And you can tie it up in litigation. I mean, I don't think anything substantial will come out of this except scaring people. Right. But and all we got to do is, get a new occupant in the White House and get to January 20th, and these problems will go away. And I think there are enough lawyers in this that we can tie it up until January 20th.
Well,
I want to know, Jeff, where did you get the $40 billion figure, the value of American education export? You know the source of that off the top of your head?
I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's
has some information. Holmes has some information on that too. So
Holmes?
Yeah, we work very closely with Miramar University out here in San Diego, and we compiled a lot of those statistics with foreign students, because we're an international chamber of commerce, so we have to take these statistics and publish them and keep them purged and updated. So I can get that over to you guys, and you can take a look at the latest statistics. But this is a staggering thing. If we let this happen, just like Kim